Right now, across the United States, meteorologists are watching a weather pattern shift into something they're calling genuinely concerning. It isn't one single storm, it isn't one single heat wave. It's a chain reaction, moving from Texas to the Gulf Coast to the East Coast, each piece feeding into the next. And for the millions of people in its path, understanding what's coming over the next several days could make a real difference. This is your weather update. If you want to stay ahead of major weather developments before they hit your area, subscribe now, because we track exactly this kind of pattern shift every single week. Let's start with where this pattern is centered right now, because it's already producing serious, life-threatening impacts. Central and West Texas have been hit by days of relentless torrential rainfall, driven by a slow-moving upper-level low-pressure system parked over the region. Some areas in the Texas Hill Country have received more than 20 inches of rain in less than a week. Rivers including the Guadalupe, the Llano, the Pedernales, and the Nueces have surged well beyond their banks, and emergency crews have carried out hundreds of water rescues across multiple counties. Officials have confirmed fatalities from this flooding, and Texas's governor has urged residents near these waterways to remain on high alert as floodwaters continue moving downstream over the coming days. This tragedy is a sobering reminder of just how dangerous slow-moving rainfall events can be, even without a named storm or hurricane involved. The same upper level, low responsible for this flooding, is now forecast to drift slowly northwestward, which should ease the most extreme rainfall over central Texas. But forecasters are cautioning that scattered heavy downpours remain possible near the Texas Big Bend region through the weekend, meaning the danger there isn't over yet. Please subscribe so you don't miss updates as this system continues evolving, because the story doesn't end in Texas. Zooming out to the bigger picture, meteorologists say this Texas flooding is just one piece of a much larger atmospheric pattern currently reshaping itself across North America. A ridge of high pressure, the same kind of feature responsible for the intense heat dome that scorched much of the central and eastern United States earlier this month, is expected to rebuild and shift, pushing the hottest, driest conditions back toward Montana and the Dakotas in the coming days. Meanwhile, the circulation around that ridge is pulling in tropical moisture from the Gulf, keeping conditions unsettled, cloudy, and wet across Texas and the Gulf Coast even as the immediate flood threat gradually eases. At the same time, forecasters are tracking a separate but connected development along the East Coast. Longer-range weather models are increasingly in agreement that a trough, essentially a dip in the jet stream that tends to usher in cooler, stormier conditions, will develop and strengthen off the eastern seaboard over the back half of this month. That would mark a real pattern change after weeks of oppressive heat across the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. But it comes with its own set of concerns, since a slow-moving area of low pressure lingering off the New England coast has already been producing periods of heavy rain, and computer models remain somewhat divided on exactly how strong and how persistent this eastern trough will become. This is exactly the kind of scenario meteorologists watch closely. Like this video if you want to understand why forecasters are paying such close attention to how these systems interact, because the answer involves something bigger than just this week's forecast. This entire pattern is unfolding against the backdrop of a strong El Niño, a climate pattern defined by warmer than average sea surface temperatures across the central and eastern Pacific Ocean. El Niño years tend to influence storm tracks across the entire country, and this year, meteorologists have noted the pattern hasn't behaved exactly like previous strong El Niño events. One leading meteorologist described the current setup as unusual enough that even experienced forecasters are approaching it with some uncertainty, noting that a blend of previous strong El Niño Julys would normally suggest cooler than average conditions from the Rockies to the Great Lakes. Yet this year's pattern has diverged from that expectation in ways that aren't fully understood yet. El Niño is also fueling enhanced tropical activity in the eastern Pacific, with forecasters flagging an increased likelihood of multiple tropical cyclones developing in that basin through the back half of July. While those systems are less likely to directly threaten the U.S. East Coast, they can still influence the broader atmospheric pattern, including the position and strength of ridges and troughs that ultimately determine whether a region sees heat, rain, or relative calm in the days ahead. Don't forget to subscribe, because understanding how all these pieces connect is exactly what separates a useful forecast from a confusing one. So let's bring this back to something practical. What does this actually mean if you live somewhere between Texas and the Northeast over the coming week and a half? For Texas and the Gulf Coast, the immediate flood emergency should gradually improve as the upper-level low drifts away, but residents near rivers and low-lying areas should continue monitoring official alerts closely, since floodwaters take time to move downstream and can create dangerous conditions well after the rain itself has stopped. Any additional rainfall, even relatively modest amounts, could significantly worsen conditions in areas that are already saturated. For the central and northern plains, expect a return of intense heat as the ridge rebuilds, with the hottest, driest conditions concentrated over Montana and the Dakotas, this wouldn't be quite as extreme or widespread as the heat dome that gripped the mid-Atlantic and Northeast earlier this month, but it still carries real health risks for outdoor workers and vulnerable populations in the affected region. And for the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, forecasters are watching for a potential shift toward cooler, stormier weather as an east coast trough develops, though the exact timing and intensity remains somewhat uncertain in the latest model guidance. If this trough strengthens, as some models suggest, it could bring a welcome break from the heat, but also an increased risk of heavy rain and slow-moving storms, particularly if it interacts with lingering low pressure off the New England coast. That uncertainty is worth sitting with for a moment because it's actually one of the more honest parts of any forecast like this. Meteorologists aren't claiming to know exactly how every detail will unfold days or a week from now. What they are increasingly confident about is the broader shape of the pattern, a ridge rebuilding over the plains, a trough attempting to develop along the east coast, and a steady stream of Gulf moisture keeping the south unsettled, all playing out against the backdrop of an unusually behaving El Niño year. For anyone in the path of any part of this pattern, the guidance from meteorologists remains consistent. Have multiple ways to receive weather alerts, since fast-developing flash flooding and severe storms can escalate with very little warning. Avoid driving through flooded roadways under any circumstances, even ones that look shallow, since floodwaters are often far more powerful and unpredictable than they appear. And continue checking updated forecasts regularly, because a pattern this dynamic, involving heat, flooding, and a developing coastal trough all at once, remains genuinely difficult to pin down with total precision more than a few days out. There's something worth remembering underneath all of this. Weather patterns like this one don't exist in isolation. The same broad atmospheric setup driving catastrophic flooding in Texas is connected to the heat building over the plains, which is connected to the storm potential developing off the east coast. Understanding that connection is exactly why meteorologists describe this as a single evolving pattern rather than a handful of unrelated local forecasts. Our thoughts remain with everyone affected by the flooding in Texas, and with the emergency crews still working around the clock in response. Let's look a little closer at what's actually driving this Texas flooding, because the mechanics behind it explain why it became so dangerous so quickly. The upper-level low responsible for this event has been unusually slow-moving, which meteorologists say is precisely what turned a heavy rain event into a catastrophic one. A fast-moving storm system typically dumps rain over an area for a few hours before pushing onward, giving rivers and drainage systems time to handle the runoff. A slow-moving system, by contrast, can sit over the same watershed for days, repeatedly wringing out moisture from the same humid air mass. That's exactly what happened here, with some communities recording well over 20 inches of rain in less than a week, an amount that would represent months of typical rainfall compressed into a matter of days. Rivers in this part of Texas are also known for reacting extremely fast to intense rainfall, a characteristic tied to the region's terrain. The Texas Hill Country sits atop shallow soil and exposed limestone, which doesn't absorb water efficiently. Instead of soaking into the ground, rainfall runs off rapidly into creeks and rivers, causing water levels to rise dramatically within a matter of hours rather than days. That's part of why this region has experienced serious flooding events in the past, and why local officials continue to emphasize preparedness and awareness of flash flood risk anytime significant rain is forecast. As floodwaters continue draining downstream over the coming days, meteorologists and emergency officials are watching several rivers closely, since the danger doesn't end once the rain stops falling in a particular location. Water that fell upstream days earlier can still cause rivers to crest and threaten downstream communities well after the skies have cleared, which is exactly why officials have urged continued caution, even as conditions improve in the hardest hit areas. Now let's shift focus to the broader atmospheric engine driving this entire pattern, because understanding it helps explain why forecasters describe this as connected rather than as isolated coincidences. High-pressure ridges and low-pressure troughs essentially act like traffic controllers for weather across an entire continent. A ridge tends to suppress rain and allow heat to build underneath it, since sinking air associated with high pressure inhibits cloud formation. A trough does roughly the opposite, encouraging rising air, cloud development, and storm formation. When a ridge builds in one region, it often pushes troughs and unsettled weather toward neighboring regions, since the atmosphere as a whole is constantly working to balance itself out. That's essentially the mechanism at play across the country right now. As high pressure rebuilds over the plains and pushes intense heat toward Montana and the Dakotas, the flow of air around that ridge is simultaneously pulling deep tropical moisture northward from the Gulf of Mexico into Texas, which is exactly what has kept the flooding threat alive even as the immediate emergency phase begins to ease. Meanwhile, farther east, models increasingly suggest that a trough will attempt to dig in along the eastern seaboard A pattern shift that would finally offer some relief from the extreme heat that gripped the mid-Atlantic and Northeast for much of the past several weeks. Meteorologists have pointed out that this kind of ridge-trough interaction, sometimes called a wave pattern in the jet stream, is a completely normal feature of summer weather. What's drawing extra attention this year is how persistent and amplified these features have become, something several forecasters have connected to the unusual behavior of this year's El Niño pattern. Don't forget to subscribe, because understanding how all these pieces connect is exactly what separates a useful forecast from a confusing one. It's worth explaining briefly what El Niño actually is, for anyone less familiar with the term. El Niño refers to a periodic warming of sea surface temperatures across the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean, occurring every few years as part of a natural climate cycle. That warming doesn't just affect ocean temperatures, it reshapes atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire globe, influencing everything from hurricane activity in the Atlantic and Pacific to rainfall patterns across the United States, often in ways that persist for months at a time. This year's El Niño has been classified as strong by climate researchers, and typically, strong El Niño summers follow certain recognizable patterns, including a tendency toward cooler than average conditions, stretching from the Rockies into the Great Lakes region. But meteorologists tracking this year's pattern have noted something unusual. Rather than following that historical blueprint closely, this year's atmospheric response has diverged in ways that have left even experienced forecasters expressing some uncertainty about exactly how the rest of the summer will unfold. One meteorologist described the situation as though the atmosphere is producing an unusual response, possibly due to the sheer strength of this particular El Niño event interacting with other factors in ways not fully captured by historical comparisons. That uncertainty matters because it directly affects forecast confidence for the pattern we're discussing today. While meteorologists are increasingly confident in the broad strokes, heat rebuilding over the plains, continued Gulf moisture keeping Texas unsettled, and an attempt at a cooler, stormier pattern taking hold along the East Coast, the finer details, including exact timing, intensity, and how long each phase will last, remain more uncertain than usual for this time of year. There's also a tropical dimension worth understanding. El Niño years tend to enhance tropical cyclone activity in the eastern Pacific Basin, while often suppressing it in the Atlantic, and this year has followed that pattern closely, with forecasters noting an increased likelihood of multiple systems developing in the eastern Pacific through the remainder of July. While these systems typically don't make landfall along the U.S. East Coast, their presence still matters. Tropical systems influence the broader flow of the atmosphere around them, and an active eastern Pacific season can indirectly affect how ridges and troughs behave across North America, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already dynamic pattern. Meteorologists also continue to closely track the Atlantic basin itself, even though this El Niño year has so far kept it relatively quiet. Warm ocean temperatures along the Gulf coast and southeastern coastline remain capable of fueling localized tropical development even without official basin-wide activity, which is part of why forecasters haven't ruled out the possibility of additional moisture surges feeding into the Gulf Coast and southeast in the coming weeks, separate from the pattern currently unfolding. Bringing this all together, the picture emerging over the next 10 days looks less like a single forecast and more like an interconnected sequence. Texas and the Gulf Coast working through the aftermath of catastrophic flooding, with residual flood risk persisting as water drains downstream. The central and northern plains bracing for renewed intense heat as high pressure rebuilds, and the mid-Atlantic and northeast watching closely for a pattern change that could finally bring relief from oppressive summer heat, tempered by its own risk of heavier rain and stronger storms if the developing trough behaves as some models currently suggest. For anyone in the path of any part of this pattern, the guidance from meteorologists remains consistent. Have multiple ways to receive weather alerts, since fast-developing flash flooding and severe storms can escalate with very little warning. Avoid driving through flooded roadways under any circumstances, even ones that look shallow, since floodwaters are often far more powerful and unpredictable than they appear. And continue checking updated forecasts regularly, because a pattern this dynamic, involving heat, flooding, and a developing coastal trough all at once, remains genuinely difficult to pin down with total precision more than a few days out. There's something worth remembering underneath all of this. Weather patterns like this one don't exist in isolation. The same broad atmospheric setup driving catastrophic flooding in Texas is connected to the heat building over the plains, which is connected to the storm potential developing off the east coast. Understanding that connection is exactly why meteorologists describe this as a single evolving pattern rather than a handful of unrelated local forecasts. If you found this forecast breakdown helpful, hit like, subscribe for continued updates as this pattern develops, and drop a comment letting me know what conditions look like where you are right now. Stay safe out there, and we'll keep tracking this one closely.